Hello and welcome to everyone. Great to have you with us. And it's great to have Jeremiah Morrow with us. He is the Senior Industry Product Marketing Manager at Vertica. And we are going to talk about what it means to be data-driven. Welcome, Jeremiah.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
Great. Thank you. Great to have you. So let's start at the start. What does it mean to be data driven? What in your view, what does that entail?
Yeah, I think it's important to start with the idea that being data driven is a journey, and you're going to find companies on the beginning and at the end. But it's really important, in my mind, to ask a few questions of your organization. What does good look like in terms of using data? And I think there are technology, people, and process questions that you can ask. So from a technology standpoint, is data an asset or is it a liability? It's almost always one of those two. Do we have the tools in place to get insights into the hands of our end users, of our business leaders, in a manner that reflects the speed of business? Do we have the tools to operationalize AI and ML? From a people standpoint, are we promoting data literacy throughout our organization? Is there top-down support for data and using data for decision making? And from a processes standpoint, do we communicate using data-driven methods? Do we rely on data?
Great. I got stuck on one thing you
Sure,
said.
sure.
And I think everything you said was very insightful just now. Is data an asset or a liability? Can it be both at the same time?
It sure can. If you, especially in a highly regulated industry like healthcare, you always have to consider the idea that your data might be a liability. And so there are important security questions with how you're storing data, with how you're moving data, especially as companies are talking about moving to the cloud. But there has to be a balance as well, because we're in an era right now in healthcare where there are strong business drivers for using data, and for leveraging data. So it's a balancing act for sure.
Absolutely. And I think where I was headed with that is we have, as an industry, an exceptional volume of data. Mm-hmm. However, it's exceptionally non-organized in many cases.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things. It's like this existential fear gripping healthcare all the time. Like we've got more data than you can shake a stick at, as they say. But is it organized? Is it usable? Is it meaningful? Do we know how valid it is? Those are questions that have been haunting us forever. And as we move more from volume into value, they become very pressing questions. They're not just abstract any longer. It's not just, oh, it would be nice if we could validate our data. It becomes a matter of, are you going to get paid?
Right. Right.
If so why is it becoming more and more important to be data driven in healthcare from your viewpoint?
Yeah, I think healthcare is experiencing a bit of a reckoning, and a lot of the data challenges were exposed with the COVID pandemic. Executive after executive after executive told us that the industry was really turned on its belly and the gaps in data were exposed, and none of us really knew what was going on in the early days of the pandemic. I still question whether we know what's going on today in terms of the pandemic, and that's a data challenge. But even before that, healthcare is one of the industries that really managed to escape the customer revolution of the last decade, due to the highly regulated nature of the industry. But there are definite regulatory, financial, and competitive reasons to renew focus really on patient centricity, and value-based care, both of which are very strong big data challenges.
Absolutely. And I also think one of the things that's really happened in the last year and a half, Jeremiah, is, and I and my team have been reporting on this and talking with people about this. The pandemic has moved the needle on consumerism in healthcare.
Hmm.
All of us are consumers. We've all been experiencing this pandemic.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has happened is, first of all, consumers realized they had a little bit more choice when we shifted dramatically quickly to telehealth for
Yep.
for as much as we could in care delivery. And then they realized that they have more options. And I think one of the things that's starting to happen now, and also at the same time, many consumers are in high deductible health insurance plans. And the having a high deductible is extremely motivating in terms of finding things out.
Yeah.
Like, will it cost X amount or X plus Y amount to have a procedure done? Should I stay with ABC Memorial Healthcare, or should I go to DEF Memorial Healthcare?
Yeah.
And we also, speaking of being a highly regulated industry, the hospital price transparency regs went into effect. It's complicated because some experts believe that they're not really giving us true transparency.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there is more data available.
For sure.
So what challenges are coming out of this as healthcare, as more data becomes available to consumers,
Hmm.
and also as patient care organization leaders need to use data more intensively? What are the biggest challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge in healthcare, well, two big challenges in healthcare, but the biggest one that I see right now is data silos. You have, if in a healthcare organization, a ton of data, but that data is either siloed by business unit, financial, clinical, operational data silos. Data can be siloed within those, within point solutions. Healthcare has a ton of platforms, point solutions that all have their own data stores. You talk about cloud and on-premises. I'm a firm believer that almost every organization, and certainly in healthcare, is not going to be consolidated on a single cloud, or on cloud alone. I think almost every company is headed towards multi-cloud and hybrid environments.
Yeah.
Each with important data stores that need to be used and leveraged. So bringing all of that data together for analytics is a massive challenge. And then from an AI and ML standpoint, the talent gap in this industry is massive.
Yeah, and we'll want to talk about that in depth in a
Yeah,
moment. But let
sure.
me ask you, a lot of vendors in this space are talking about unifying data.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's necessary or even realistic to try to create a central data lake or some such architecture?
Yeah,
What's your view on it?
I don't think so, and this is definitely a hot debate in the database space for sure. A lot of companies are suggesting move all of your data into our platform, in the cloud or in one place, and they have good reasons for that. Most of them are hardware vendors, so
Yeah.
they benefit from you storing all of your data in their cloud, on their platform. But migration projects slow the pace of transformation significantly. And in industries where I do believe we're going to be definitely hybrid, having access to data on premises as well as in the cloud for analytics is super important. And so we should be thinking about unifying data for sure, having access to all of your data, but in a distributed way, so that you can access those data stores across your organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. And I also think it's realistic in the sense that it's very hard to create change in healthcare organizations.
Yeah.
Patient care organizations move gradually. There's no 100%, day one we're here and day two we're there. It's too hard. It's too
Yeah.
hard.
We talked to a lot of companies who have told us they're on like a 3 to 5 year project to build a centralized data lake. And our response to them is always, your end users can't wait 3 to 5 years for a unified view of the data. They need that today, and they need that now.
Yeah,
So yeah.
absolutely. So let's talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, AI
Yep.
and ML. We see a lot of different percentages regarding the success rate. And I've been writing about this fairly intensively in the last few months. I've seen a statistic that 8 in 10 AI and ML models fail to make it into production. I will just share that I attended RSNA, Radiological Society of North America meeting at the end of November, beginning of December, and everything was about AI. But the reality is that it's moving ahead pretty slowly in healthcare because it's being driven by use cases, and those have to essentially be homegrown each time. Anyway, I rambled a bit, but what's your view of how AI and ML are actually progressing right now?
Yeah, I think in healthcare, very slowly. I think you're right on. It turns out, and it's interesting because if you look at any annual report, you look at what executives are saying, there's this massive gap between what they're promising shareholders and what their analytics departments are actually able to deliver in terms of AI and ML. So you see all of the buzzwords. But most organizations and most analytics teams are in a place where they're just trying to get a hold of historical data in a meaningful way and deliver that to their end users. So AI and ML is much harder than most companies expect it to be. It takes a lot of effort to downsample the data, move that data out of the database, which what you have to do with most of the AI and ML tools today. Train that model and then bring that model back in the database and drop it into a 30-year-old data warehouse and hope it works. That's a ton of effort. And we hear most data scientists today are spending a majority of their time integrating data sources, which is a pretty low value activity for a very highly skilled and highly trained employee.
Yeah, and in patient care delivery, we have additional layers of complexity because I'll use the radiological example again. First of all, you have to pair data scientists with knowledgeable clinical informaticists. And the clinical informaticists have to explain to them what they're looking for, right?
Yeah.
And it is moving forward bit by bit by bit and again, I'll cite radiology as one example. But what they're finding is that every single organization is architected differently in, both in terms of data and in terms of workflow of clinicians. And so that's really slowing things because there's no off the shelf for this kind of thing. And the use cases that they're coming up with, for example, in radiology, alerting to abnormal findings in the workflow, so that if a radiologist has to do 10 reads, the algorithm says, "Oh, doctor, go to number 7, study number 7 instead of study number 1." That's one of the main use cases. But to put that into the workflow, every workflow is customized in every radiology practice in the country, and so you can't simply plug it in, which is a fascinating problem, right?
Absolutely. And I think you touched on something. Obviously, we're a tool. We're not a consulting firm, but I've talked to a lot of data scientists. We have data scientists on our team working on our ML products. And one of the pieces of advice I've picked up in my conversations is exactly what you're saying, which is these teams creating these models have to be cross-functional. A data scientist is not going to know exactly what types of data they need to bring in to solve a use case. And so if you don't have cross-functional teams, that's going to lead to either that model never making it into production or that model never realizing its intended value,
Right.
which are both very important to the success of your predictive analytics projects.
Right. And if you're doing anything clinical, the clinicians have to see value in what
Yeah.
you created.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone could create an algorithm for something tiny and minuscule that doesn't matter. People can do that. But then the clinicians are going to be like, well, why did you do this? Why you solved a problem that doesn't really help us.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that's another really important point, I think, for in terms of advice that I could give a company that's just starting off in this AI and ML journey is find a business problem that you can solve and prove value. That should be your first AI and ML project. We have a lot of customers looking at AI and ML to solve the question of hospital readmissions, which has a definite financial impact. It has a definite value to the customer. It has a definite value to the physician. And if you can solve that problem and you can prove value, then you can rely on and move other predictive analytics projects forward. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Readmissions reduction is a huge thing. I mean, first of all, it's mandated by the federal government.
Yeah.
And a majority last year of hospitals were dinged, to use the non-technically correct term. They had their Medicare reimbursement lowered for avoidable readmissions. The challenge there, I'm glad you brought that up. The challenge there is that many years ago, when hospitals created their core databases and their core functions, they did not realize that they would need to be analyzing readmissions. So nothing was set up to do that. And so now they're having to go back and rethink how they get their data, how they use their data, how they cleanse their data. It's hard. It's turning out to be hard, actually. So can you give us an example of how one of your patient care organization customers is using data to produce better outcomes?
Sure. I'm going to use an example that affects a lot of different providers. It's probably one of my favorite stories, and that's Cerner. So Cerner's a customer of ours. They embed our analytics platform within Millennium and also within their population health platform. And what they're doing from a population health standpoint is using predictive analytics to either identify better paths of care for a patient, and they're also using it, it's a pretty personal mission for them, to eliminate deaths from sepsis. So they're looking at patient records, they are looking at indicators of possible septic shock, and they've eliminated, over the course of the last several years, millions of, or identified millions of possible cases and scheduled early intervention to make sure that those patients didn't die of septic shock. Really cool story. One of those things that, makes you feel good about what you're doing every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And sepsis is it's extremely important. One of the things that clinicians have always known is that when a patient slides into sepsis, they do so imperceptibly and quickly. So Mrs. Smith is lying in the hospital bed and she appears to be okay. She's recovering from surgery, let's say, and she appears to be okay, and the nurse checks on her at, let's say 1 p.m., 1 in the afternoon, and all her vitals are good, her signs are good. Then someone comes back at 3 and suddenly they realize she's in sepsis. So one of the great things that some patient care organization leaders are doing is they're huddling. I mean, and it does take a whole team. It takes data scientists, it takes clinicians, it takes clinical informaticists, and they're sitting down and analyzing the data to determine when does this happen, how quickly does this happen, and under what circumstances, and then they build algorithms and train them so that they can alert the clinicians. And it's a great use because lay people who are outside healthcare have no idea how common sepsis actually
Yeah.
is. It's extremely common. It's just not very well known in the general public. So yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, and it takes a couple of things that I think are important from a data standpoint and from an operationalizing AI and ML standpoint. The first is accuracy. So with so many AI and ML tools out there, what you're doing is essentially you're downsampling a ton of data because your tool can't analyze the petabytes of data that you have that could
Yeah.
help you determine sepsis. So in database machine learning, which uses massively parallel processing to analyze a ton of data and train your model very quickly, leads to an ultimately more accurate model. The other thing it does is it helps companies retrain models. So your first model isn't as important as your newest model and the freshest data available. So in database machine learning is a capability that a lot of companies are picking up on for both accuracy and for also the speed of training a model and getting it into production.
Yeah, yeah, very important point. Thank you.
Yep.
One of the interesting elements in healthcare, one of the largest new sources of data, among the largest new sources of data will be semi-structured and unstructured data, especially IoT data.
Yeah.
How can hospitals, medical groups, and health systems think about IoT data and the value that it might bring?
Yeah, and I think it's an important question for almost every industry, but definitely for healthcare, where you have a ton of devices producing a ton of data. First of all, it's expensive to collect and store all of that data, so you better have a good purpose for it at the end of the day. The second thing is, I think getting value out of IoT data is absolutely a unified analytics challenge. So that data sitting in a data lake, being collected, some medical devices produce millions of data points every single day. How do you put context around that data? And the answer is using historical data to understand what do those measurements and readings from those devices mean, and how should we be able to take action on it. So combining semi-structured and unstructured data with all of the data that you have across your organization to give it context is really the way to drive value with IoT data.
Absolutely. Do you have an example of a customer that's doing something cool with IoT data?
I do, and it's probably my favorite story at Vertica, and that is Philips Healthcare. Everybody probably knows them as a large provider of medical devices. So they are using analytics and IoT data for predictive maintenance on all of their medical devices. So I mentioned an MRI machine produces something like 1 million data points every single day. So Philips is collecting all of that data. It lands in a data lake. They do some transformation to it. They move it into their database. They're combining it with historical data from old business systems, from legacy databases, bringing all of that together to give that device data context. Sales records, service records, old diagnostic reports, that kind of thing. The whole goal is to identify before a device fails, what are the potential indicators of failure? So they are marching towards zero unplanned downtime. They're monitoring those devices 24/7. And often they show up to repair a device before a physician understands that there's an issue with it. So really cool big data story. A lot of medical device companies have gotten to remote monitoring of their devices, but very few of them have gotten to actual predictive maintenance. And so it's definitely a competitive advantage for Philips and really great outcomes
Yeah,
with IoT data.
that is good. Thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So let's end on upbeat, practical note, can you share with us the most important things you think our audience needs to think about as they're on their journey towards becoming data-driven? What
Sure.
should they most be thinking about?
Yeah. I think for three things. I think I'll start with the idea that data management, real-time and predictive analytics, they're really the beating heart of digital transformation. If you look across industries at companies who have become disruptors in their space, they're able to take tons of data and combine it for business and customer value using predictive and real-time analytics. So this is really important, and it has to be a priority today. Second, I think unified analytics also has to be a priority. We have data silos across our organizations, and the biggest barrier to value from your data is bringing all of that data together. But creating a central data lake can slow that process down, make it really difficult and time consuming and expensive. You should be choosing tools and capabilities that allow you to care more about the analytics than where the data is stored.
Mm,
And the last thing that I would say is get to work now on predictive analytics. Every company wants to move that direction. You need to be looking at your organization and thinking about the gaps that you have in your capabilities and in your tools. And how can you close that gap quickly and get to predictive?
yeah, I think, well, first of all, great advice. Thank you so much, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And I feel optimistic, even though we're early on in this very long journey with many chapters in it. But the reason I feel optimistic is there are a lot of very smart people in healthcare, smart, dedicated, hardworking, determined people, and we have a burning platform.
Yep.
So the Medicare actuaries came out again last year and predicted we're going to go over 6 trillion in annualized overall healthcare expenditures in the US.
Yeah.
We were at 3.6 trillion. Obviously, the pandemic is having a huge impact. But in any case, we were on this terrible glide path toward disaster in terms of
Yep.
cost. And 6 trillion, it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
6 trillion a year. So yet I feel optimistic in the sense that we now are in a place where people are figuring out how to do predictive analytics, and they're figuring out what AI and ML are for. Now,
Yeah.
does that mean they've mastered them? No, not at all. But at least they're realizing what they can be, the best use cases, and they're figuring out what kinds of teams they need to build and how they need to move forward strategically. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. Do you share that?
I agree. I've always I've worked with healthcare vendors, healthcare technology vendors, and providers for about 10 years now, and patient centricity has always been a buzzword. And the cynic in me has always thought that maybe it would always be a buzzword, but um, you can't beat the enemy until you can name the enemy. And the enemy right now is data silos and the long, slow journey to AI and predictive analytics. But we know the challenges now. And we know what the solutions are, and I'm much more heartened that this renewed focus on patient centricity and value-based care is going to take off. I'm really excited for the future of
Yeah,
the industry.
me too. Wonderful. Well, it's been really great speaking with you today, Jeremiah.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time, Mark, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of you in our audience for participating. This concludes this session. Again, thank you, Jeremiah Morrow and Vertica. Thank you.
Thank you.